We are excited and humbled to have a very important conversation today about rural America. We all know the polarization that has long affected our country, and we have much work to do. If the newly turned blue state of Georgia has taught us anything, it is that elevating the voices of rural and small town communities is incredibly important, and this work must be continued in other states across the country, like West Virginia. It's not just about election cycles, but building trust in communities and making people's lives better year round. So this brings me to Will Carter, our guest speaker today. Will Carter is a lifelong West Virginian. Since 2017, Will has applied his early career experience from 1984 to 1999 as a public interest lawyer and his experience since 2000 as a successful business person, to focusing the third of his career on building progressive but pragmatic civic and political infrastructure, in small city and rural communities in presidential and Senate battleground states. He is the founding donor of the Rural Democracy Initiative and For West Virginia's Future, and is active in national philanthropic efforts to counterbalance the impact of investments made by ultra-conservative political interests. I would also be remiss not to mention, which we talked about earlier, that Will is also a lifelong string band musician playing in a regional weekend touring band called Blue Yonder, which you heard, if you came on early, you heard it. Will learned at a young age as a community organizer and activist that string band music provides a, quote, uncommonly effective way to bring diverse communities together across age, geography, politics, and race, making it meaningful political work as well as soul cleansing, in the moment fun. Will, thank you so much for being here, and I will now turn it over to you.
Gosh, thank you, Vanessa. It's interesting to hear some of those words come back from sources. You did your homework. And thanks to, gosh, everybody with Big Tent. Renee and I are excited to share with you an example of what can happen in communities in rural and small city areas, and how that fits into a larger political effort that I and others are very involved in trying to add to the equation across the country. So thanks for the opportunity to speak with you, but more fundamentally, just really appreciate that you all are taking on the challenge of staking out what I call a transcendent middle, a perspective that pulls the wisdom from both traditional and conservative traditions, as well as liberal and progressive traditions, and leaves behind the parts of those traditions that are not as healthy. And so I don't speak in terms of compromise, because that makes it sound like you're just between the two extremes. I think of it as a transcendent middle that takes what's good and leaves what's bad behind, and creates, I think, the possibility of a new political way in this country. There's no guarantee we'll get there. I don't think we can build the country we'd like to have for our children and grandchildren, though, if we don't figure out how to do that. Constitutionally, we cannot count on the demographic destiny of increasingly diverse urban centers having enough votes to win this, a forward-looking, fact-based, science-based, democracy-based country, because of the nature of economies concentrate people in the cities that are growing. But our Constitution says that our Senate is going to always be controlled by states that have lower populations. And if we don't figure out how to communicate effectively with small city and rural communities, it's hard for me to figure out how to get out of the situation that we're in this country. I really believe that though Donald Trump certainly revealed and heightened the divides going on in this country, he didn't create them. They're anchored in deep economic and cultural forces that we have to acknowledge. And as long as our political elite, frankly, both Republican and Democrat, are focused in the big cities in terms of leadership, and then the conservative, the very conservative, ultra conservative perspectives are doing a great job organizing across America, in small city and rural America. It's going to be very hard to end up with the kind of national political leadership, much less state political leadership we need. So I think it begins with having a story that it is possible to be progressive and cross-partisan, which is something that a lot of my colleagues on the left would disagree with. I recognize that. But I also recognize that a lot of the progressive movement is recognizing that what they're doing isn't working. 70 million people voted for Donald Trump, okay? And a lot of those are decent folks. There are cultural and economic forces at work, and a group like Big Tent that is unashamed about putting forward what I'm going to again call a transcendent middle, not a center. This is not a compromise that cuts the differences between both. It lifts the wisdom for both perspectives and goes forward into something new and possible is, I think, just a great mission that I'm pleased to be able to be a part of. When I decided to start trying to do something about the political environment in West Virginia after I sold my interest in my company in 2016, and probably like a lot of you guys started getting involved in 2017, I assumed that there was a group of forward-thinking, progressive but pragmatic people inside the Democratic Party or inside the progressive universe and ecosystem in DC and other sort of metro areas that was thinking about how to be more effective in small city and rural markets across battleground states. And what I learned is that was not the case. Lots of people agreed that it was important. These were, experienced, accomplished political operatives, but nobody was paid all day, every day to pay attention to that topic. And so I identified enough people who had lots of identity and accomplishment in the national political domain who vouched for that important work to raise some money to form a group called the Rural Democracy Initiative. And that organization exists for the sake of increasing investment, not only cash, but also competence and volunteer time and energy. And Renee can talk about some of how that's coming into West Virginia. That is making an effort to build trust in small city and rural environments that we have to do to take our country forward. The Rural Democracy Initiative is an example of a structure that I think this group may already be aware of in part, but it's so fundamental that I wanted to talk about it a little. I think it's helpful to frame it. I'm going to share my screen here with a picture of a map that shows a map that the Koch brothers demonstrates one researcher's way of demonstrating where the Koch brothers have been investing since 2004 in their libertarian and conservative infrastructure. The two Koch brothers put $100 million into that program. And so just to get it started. And they've continued to invest since 2004. And what they saw was that in our country, there needed to be state-based organizations being built, 501c3 organizations that did education and research, 501c4 organizations that did lobbying and could receive contributions that would not be disclosed and put into elections, called dark money. And they built a very robust network, an ecosystem of very conservative political operatives that were there to pounce when there was a populist blowback to the 2008 recession, followed by the 2009 support for corporate America, while lots of people in places like West Virginia were suffering. They funded the Tea Party movement and built a very, very strong network that in less than a year reversed 80 years of Democratic dominance in West Virginia. okay, in less than a decade, reversed 80 years of Democratic dominance in West Virginia. They first invested in West Virginia in 2010, and by 2014, the both chambers of our legislature had flipped from blue to red, and we began seeing the kind of political leadership that we associate now with QAnon, three percenters, divisive, non-fact-based, non-science-based perspectives, where winning a partisan debate is all that matters. And this happened in states all over the country, and has been a real challenge as people who want to continue a democracy and want to uphold a lot of what we hold dear in sort of suburban, comfortable, middle class, upper middle class lifestyles in the metro areas, and want to be able to have a country that can sustain that. Meanwhile, 90% of the geography in our country is really suffering and not doing very well. And some of the reading in advance was designed to bring that forth. So from a political standpoint, there was another group that came along and said, well, we need to match this, okay, from the progressive standpoint. And so here's a picture of a map that shows an approach that the progressive and liberal interests, largely out of the DC, New York, Bay Area, system, but mostly on the East Coast, came together with a more decentralized approach. They didn't have one family that was willing to put such a huge amount into it, but they gradually built a network of what are called donor tables. Okay, donor tables exist in all of the blue states here, in green states. You can see West Virginia is an emerging donor table. And they're an important part of the independent infrastructure. If you all are trying to sort of evaluate where there's year-round work going on, that between the elections, where is there action happening that is not partisan because you are committed to being nonpartisan, understanding these donor tables that are scattered around the country in battleground states is an important part of the ecosystem that's out there, because they support not just work during elections, but they support voter registration and voter education that is nonpartisan by 501c3 organizations in their states. They support issue advocacy on things like access to ballots and voter suppression, and other policies that can strengthen our democracy by C4 organizations and advocacy groups. And they do run independent political campaigns during election season that cannot be coordinated with the candidates, cannot be coordinated with the parties, but are designed to provide some counterbalance to the independent money that's being spent on the right side. So this is just part of a progressive ecosystem that, as you all are contemplating, how to make a difference, not just in the 6 months leading up to an election, but year round, and how to support those who do, how the donor tables that are in these states are an example of a state-based infrastructure that you can go to learn about. We really care about, let's say you really care about a particular state. You can go to the donor table in that state, and they're in a position of being like a local grant maker that specializes in building the capacity, the permanent capacity, and building relationships in the communities that they want to mobilize. Now, most of the donor tables, take Pennsylvania as an example, are anchored in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. They reflect the same relatively large metro, orientation that the party does and the progressive interest across the country do. Where the Rural Democracy Initiative comes in is to serve as a national rural donor table, where we raise money to invest in the rural parts of these states, but we try to do so whenever possible in consultation and in coordination with the state donor tables. And so one of the things that I thought might be useful is for you all to see how this is applying in action in West Virginia, which, again, as you can see from the color coding, has a relatively new donor table that Renee Haggerty is responsible for leading. And so that's an element of the structure that she'll talk about how some of that's rolling out. Before we transition, though, I want to touch on an important part of the work that is not structural, it's narrative, it's linguistic. And it's to say that one of our challenges is to recognize that we have to come up with a language that the middle 70% of West Virginians can relate to, and the same for the rest of the country, if we hope to establish a practical, pragmatic, science-based, democracy supporting political movement or political base in the country. And so I'm going to end what I have to say by turning to a section, just a run through of what our research shows the kind of narrative that can work in the state. I switched screens. Are you all able to see a screen that now shows components of a cross-partisan stand? Okay, great. So this is not anything that is public, okay? It is part of our sort of ongoing effort at this point to frame a strong stand, but one that can reach across partisan frameworks. So I'm going to just take them one at a time. We share a moral, practical responsibility to do what we can to take care of ourselves, our families, our community, the nation, and the world. So you can see that's both a left and right sort of orientation now and for future generations. The strongest narrative frame in West Virginia is one that talks about coming together to build communities our children and grandchildren will choose to make our homes. There's nothing more biologically motivating than that core concern. Second item, respecting diverse traditions and beliefs rather than trying to bring them down. And the ideas that are diverse about what it means to live a good life. It is, those who choose, like me, to live in a rural area, we don't do it out of weakness. We do it because we love it. There's a certain appeal to us, but also respecting facts, economics, and science. And both extremes of political perspectives can sometimes disregard those and focus on uniting around shared beliefs rather than dividing us where we disagree. We clearly see our political leaders doing that. Although I would say that is not symmetrical. Right now, I see the Republicans doing that in a much more damaging and dangerous way than the Democrats. We need to strive to eliminate obstacles to success that people face through no fault of their own. Though welfare and support for people who have had, racial and economic barriers to success is something that West Virginians support. It's not something that we necessarily lead with, but they do believe strongly in it. West Virginia has the highest percentage of people who have relied in some meaningful way on help from their neighbors in any other country. A cross-partisan stand distrusts extreme concentration of political or economic power and believes there's wisdom and weakness to be found in both major political parties. Practicality is critically important. We need to work through the challenges of solving problems. And very significantly in today's political marketplace, who would have thought this would be a point of political contention a decade ago? That democracy that limits the impact of dark money, reduces partisan districting, and makes it easy for everybody to participate and to vote who's eligible is the best way to advance principles 1 through 5 above. So this is something that is in the background of the language and the coaching that Renee has been offering as a tidal wave of interest in West Virginia has appeared because of Senator Joe Manchin's pivotal role in so much legislation that is working its way through Congress. So with that, I'll stop the share and let Renee take over.
Hi there, Will and everybody. Thank you. Hope you're all doing well on this Tuesday. I am, as Will mentioned, Renee Haggerty, she, her pronouns. I'm the executive director for West Virginia's Future. Please excuse me if my eyes are all over the place. I'm not used to the captions on. I think that's fantastic, but it is going to take me a moment to sort of adjust here. I appreciate your patience. I do have a couple of slides for us to sort of build in. I think Will did a great job highlighting how progressive independent infrastructure fits into this larger landscape. And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what that means specifically for West Virginia. All right, here we go. So for West Virginia's Future, as Will mentioned, is a donor table. So we see our role as sitting at the nexus between local, state, and national partners who have this shared vision of a political future for West Virginia that is based on what works for our children and our grandchildren for multiple generations. How do we make West Virginia the state that we all want it to be? And I do mean all when I say that. We know that the vast majority of West Virginians share that sense of what our state can be. And our job For West Virginia's Future is to empower our neighbors to have the tools and resources they need to enact that vision, to bring their political reality along and meet the vision of their future that they wish to see. So what does that actually mean in practicality? That means that we operate inside of this matrix here. We operate in between, at this moment, a lot of national interest in pursuing a particular political goal, whether that's an individual issue like the For the People Act or improvements in infrastructure. Any individual issue might be something that we negotiate, but also the local interest in building infrastructure politically. So what does political infrastructure actually mean? When we talk about political infrastructure, we mean the research and analysis to do high quality work effectively. We mean the narratives and messages to carry that work out into the community. And we mean the campaigns and messengers who do the carrying. So we're really looking to build out all three of these elements. What do we need to be able to do that? We need organizations on the ground who have this type of capability. Right now, For West Virginia's Future is focused on building up essentially bridge organizations to take our hyper-local, highly effective community-based groups and elevate their work to the point where they can be best practices, not just in their issue area or community, but across the state, and empower and train others. So on a regular basis, that means plugging in national partners and their funding, resource, and expertise to state or local level folks who can actually carry that work forward in a meaningful way, not just in this moment of the whirlwind, but also in a way that can be built on for years to come. So, for example, a TV ad may be great as a messenger for a particular campaign, and it may be based on research and analysis and have a solid message, but it's not going to linger, right? It's not going to linger in our state as infrastructure unless that message is also carried forth by organizers or organizations who are going to be there beyond that individual TV ad. So when we're thinking about infrastructure, that's what we're thinking about. What is staying in our state, and how do we make sure that that is high quality and effective for the vast majority of West Virginians, building the political future that we want to see? In this particular moment, that means our work centers on what you would consider a standard campaign, but it looks a little different depending on who we're talking to. So we support, at For West Virginia's Future, we support script and other forward-facing material development. And what that means is that we take the research that Will and others have developed through polling and other testing, we combine that with local insights and national best practices and generate one collaborative message document that everyone, regardless of their level, can use to put out messages from a single text message to a full TV ad. We also network and map the full range of influencers on these issues so that we can elevate this appropriate spokespeople for the audiences that we're trying to reach. So for example, making sure that we are reaching trusted election officials and others who are seen as nonpartisan, who have the trust of their communities, but can carry progressive messages forward in this moment or persuasive messages forward in this moment. Same thing with paid media. We want to make sure that whether we're on TV, radio, digital, or postcards, that we're communicating in a way that the vast majority of West Virginians can see themselves in, so they don't immediately get turned off by that partisan framing. And then with field, we really want to put an emphasis on this. It may surprise you, for those of you that are in battleground states, but in West Virginia, statewide and federal level candidates almost never run a physical field campaign. The last several decades, it's mostly been TV and paid media. And so a big part of the infrastructure that we see it being vital to build out is those person-to-person connections, actually talking to our friends and neighbors, whether that's at the door or on a phone bank or via texting. Having those interactions, building together, very important for our long-term viability in the state. All right, so how do we do this? That's a lot of things for one individual organization to do. It's a lot of things for our entire coalition to be working on in any individual moment. The big how is by asking our national partners to leverage their resources to maximize the impact of local human capital and networks. So that's a lot of words. What does that mean in practicality? In practicality, it means that For West Virginia's Future has conversations with everyone and essentially identifies who has what strengths, how can we patch and piece all of those together in a way that's going to build that long-term lasting infrastructure while meeting our demands for this particular moment. So an example is phone banking. Phone banking is often in this time where COVID is still hanging around us, phone banking is one of the most used tactics for reaching out. However, it is also an incredibly expensive and time-consuming way to reach folks if you are paying for the human capital that is on the phone making those calls. So For West Virginia's Future has worked to broker partnerships with national organizations who have out-of-state folks who are passionate about passing any number of federal issues and who want to be involved in West Virginia. And we've given them a space to do that connects with our local folks. So what do I mean? What I mean is that on a weekly basis, we have hundreds of volunteers from California to Maine calling on scripts that we have generated into West Virginia to lists of people that we have targeted, making persuasive scripts to them to call their senator to support a piece of legislation, or just providing them with informational education about the issue. So that's how our national partners are plugging in. They're providing the tools and they're providing the manpower to do this massive outreach. And they're doing it in a way that our partners are supporting to make sure that it's sensitive to the political situation in West Virginia and the priorities of her people. But that's not where it stops. It would be one thing to say we have coordinated a phone bank. The big magic here is that the infrastructure is what lasts, right? So what happens after you reach out to someone the first time? Maybe they call their senator, maybe they don't. Then what happens? The magic is the follow-up. The magic is the follow-up with the relational organizing. And that's what's happening right now in West Virginia. Across the board, whether we're talking about phone banking, digital ads, postcards, every step of the process, we have set it up so that national sources are providing the mass outreach, and then our local groups are following up to anyone who positively responds to make sure that they have an opportunity to connect with a local group that is civically engaged on those issues so that they can attend an event and actually meet their neighbors, or they can take a follow-up action, maybe send an email, post on social media. In this moment of high connectivity, there are so many ways for us to be relating to each other, but most of us, especially in West Virginia, still need that outreach to make the connection so that we can go beyond the partisan silos that we're used to operating in. And that's what we're really excited to be doing right now in our effort to build this infrastructure. We're making sure that every opportunity we have to make something last, we're taking it in a way that the vast majority of West Virginians can see themselves in, not just today, but long term. All right, I think I skipped ahead of my slides here. So the who part of the slide we just talked about, who, everybody. And what do I mean by everybody? I mean anyone who wants to see a prosperous West Virginia, right? Who wants to see a better West Virginia for their children and their grandchildren, a place that they can want and choose to call home. All right. I think that's it for me, but I have a feeling we're going to have lots of questions. I personally just want to take a moment, I didn't at the top, to say, to echo what Will said about how excited we are to have the opportunity to talk with you all. I think from everything that I've heard, we seem to share a very strong alignment around the need to build this transcendent middle and the opportunity to engage folks in our community who can be strong messengers, not just today, but long term. So very excited to hear what questions you have.
Great. Thank you so much, Renee. That was wonderful. Yes, we do have some questions coming in, so I encourage everyone, please put your questions in the chat. So the first one that came in, do you worry that outside callers will have a negative impact for phone banking? And just referencing that Maine didn't like that outsiders were trying to tell them what to do, and they voted for Susan Collins in reaction.
We get this question all the time, and it is a real risk. But the truth of the matter is that in this moment, we have to find ways through the risk and not avoid it. So here's how we're handling that. The first piece is having out-of-state groups partner with on-the-ground associations. So for our phone banking, whenever you get a call, you'll hear, "Hi, my name is Renee. I'm with West Virginians for Democracy and Common Cause, represent us," one of these national groups. So right off the top, we're saying, I'm not just from out of state, I am also part of the West Virginia fabric, right? So that's the first piece, is the priming. The second piece is a cultural competency training. We make sure that every group that leads a phone bank gets trained by our coordinator. How do you approach a West Virginian? Do you say ma'am? Do you use first names, last names? Simple things that culturally can prime you to have a positive response. We also coach them through some typical stereotypes and how to avoid referencing those if they have them. And otherwise, West Virginians are people. We just want to be talked to like humans. So as long as you're being honest with us about who you are and why you're calling, you're probably going to be okay. But those other pieces help us sort of get off on the right foot.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting in West Virginia is, since we have been largely ignored by the on the political landscape in terms of being a winnable state or a battleground state, people here haven't been flooded with calls like somebody mentioned in North Carolina. That's the case. So that's one difference. But I also think that generally West Virginians, I mean, there's a long history of West Virginians working effectively with out-of-state organizers, particularly in the union tradition. But Jay Rockefeller stands for that. I mean, he was a wealthy guy who came down here as a Vista worker. So West Virginians, as long as you're authentic about who you are and what you're there and why you think you have an offer of help, will listen. There's not like this air of Southern hospitality in West Virginia. It's just sort of practical. But it is, I'm hearing from callers that out of state that they really enjoy the conversations. But it is something that has to be carefully crafted. It's easy to make unintentional microaggressions. And so we looked at that. Couple of tactical points that I think are really important and illustrate the value of a centralized state strategy around cell phone numbers and things like that. Renee, somebody was asking, how do we go about getting phone numbers? And that step's easy, but then how do we go about sharing it with our voter file? You might talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Yes. So I think the first thing is to dispel the myth that just because you're not getting calls on your cell phone, that means that folks don't have your cell phone number. That's not accurate. More so, the challenge with cell phone numbers and political work is the technology that allows us to reach you. So legally, there has to be a human involved in the process of dialing a phone number for it to be legal for them to contact you. Landlines, there are a lot of softwares out there that have it set up so that they can call legally in very quick succession. Cell phones, there's only a couple, and to a certain extent, they are more expensive. We have invested in that, and so we're able to call cell phones as well as landlines. It is slower. They tend to go to voicemail more often or get flagged as spam. That's a bunch of technical stuff that we have to work through. It's a headache, but it's worth it because, like you said, a lot of folks don't have home phones anymore, or if they do, they use it as the spam line and they don't answer it. So that is a challenge. The way we handle that in West Virginia is we try to take as much of that burden away from our local organizations as possible. So we don't want our 2 or 3 person healthcare organization to be stressed about how the technical legality of cell phone calls work. So we have a voter file and we purchase updated phone numbers and we purchase modeling that helps us identify who in our voter file is the best person to call for a particular issue, statistically speaking. And then we make that available to our local community groups on a regular basis. Depending on their partnership status, they can either get that for free, they just have to bring their volunteers, or we charge either at cost or an upcharge to cover staff time if it's like a national or not perfectly aligned group that's working outside of the coalition. So we make these resources available to folks so that it's shared. And that way, the data that the healthcare campaign learns can also benefit the democracy campaign and everyone beyond that.
There's a structure that is also exists alongside the donor tables that, to the extent that you want to understand how this inter-election work is building power towards the next election, it's called C3 and C4 tables. The Rural Democracy Initiative gave hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Wisconsin C3 Roundtable. And it's basically a coalition of C3 organizations, the makeup of which is very constituent specific. It might be people working on healthcare, it might be people working on immigrant outreach, it might be people working or organizations working to serve communities of color or civil rights. They tend to be very issue-oriented organizations, but they come together around these coalitions called C3 and C4 tables in a way that really can increase access to the ballot to structurally disenfranchised communities, can provide education to, that works in terms of addressing concerns that are really in place on the local level. So the C3 and C4 tables are an important part of what the state-based donor tables are funding, as well as the national investors that come in here. And that's something. And those tables then can share a single subscription to a voter file, a single subscription to a telephone calling service, and a core training and education for how to do that. So part of the job is making all of the relationships that the existing state-based groups have, but they have identity and focus in one area, how to bring those together to have the whole be much bigger than the sum of the parts. That's what the C3, C4 tables, with help from the communications hub, often a separate entity, as well as the donor table at the state level, come together. A couple of questions early on about the relevance of this work in other states. It is really important to understand that small city and rural communities vary substantially across the country. So each one has to be customized to whatever situation is at hand. So a lot of people don't realize that 20% of rural America are communities of color, okay? And so when we're working in southwestern Georgia, where a grant from the Rural Democracy Initiative supported an effort by a group that gave us no plan. We knew we didn't have much time. We sent the money down there. They got 94% voter participation in these rural counties of southern Alabama, southern Georgia, working through women in the Black community who just cracked the whip and got people out. And so that's a very different strategy than we deployed in northern Arizona, where the Native American community had been split, and some of its leaders were formally stumping for Trump. And so we invested the Rural Democracy Initiative in outreach to Native Americans in Arizona. And so that's different than small towns in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania that have been hurt by the deindustrialization of America. So though there are shared cultural frames that and values across these rural areas, that the economic and social context are very different. And the reason we get beat in the rural areas is that the Republicans are zeroing in on the cultural things that are shared, whether it is an inherent, conservatism or a, let me show an example of this from, I'll share the slide too, because it also answers the question about research. Hold on just a second here. We very much rely on research, and it guides a lot of what we do. And here's an example of how we apply that. So in West Virginia, right now, less than 30%, the most recent numbers I've seen, this is from the winter of 2020, about 26% of West Virginians say that I identify as a Democrat, okay? And about 35% of people say I identify as a Republican. So there's a big group in the middle that doesn't identify strongly with either one. And the size of this varies somewhat across rural America, but generally it is safe to say that less than 4 out of 10 people in small city and rural America identify with Republicans. That is true. But if you ask most people in progressive, urban, large metro areas, they're going to say 70% voted for Trump. They're all hardcore conservatives. And what that ignores is the social context that makes things very hard for people from an economic standpoint, and who their connections are. And so what we have to do is tailor the effort to be specific on the economic and the social situations that are at work in a given community, because the values the Republicans have done a pretty good job zeroing in on. We're not going to beat them talking about the noble side of conservative values, because they're already talking about those. What we have to say is we're not part of the conservative values that are leaving people to blame others and to divide and to deny people access to the ballot. Those are values we're fighting, but we also have to be fighting for something that is economically based. And that's why it's so important to have this anchored in a way that is important. And this is another example of polling that we've used. So we had 44% of people said they were conservative in West Virginia, 32% moderate, only 18% liberal. But then when asked, which do you agree with more? State government needs to do more to help hardworking West Virginians get ahead, or state government does more harm than good and should be made as small as possible. In this rural area, though they are conservative, when the pollster looked at this, he said, wait a minute, how can they be so conservative and so supportive of government action? Well, this is the land that saw great benefits from FDR, saw great benefits from JFK and LBJ's investments, who holds Senator Byrd as another giant in political history because he brought federal money here. So there's not an anti-government bias in this part of rural America like there is maybe out west. It's a very different climate. And polling helps us illuminate that in a way that I think is very helpful and helps us understand where we can be effective and where we can't. Renee, there's some questions about, hold on, let me pull up my notes here. How are you connecting to state groups? Okay. Mm-hmm. And how that in turn manifests, for instance, in events that we're planning. You can give some examples there?
Absolutely. I feel like you hinted at the answer to this already, Will, with the mention of the C3 and C4 tables. So when we're talking about the infrastructure that needs to be built in the state, we are speaking in part, a huge core part of that is the connections with local and state organizations through the C4 table network. So for my part as the donor table executive, I fund specifically based on the recommendations of our local partners who participate in what will eventually become the C3 and C4 table. Currently, they're sort of unaffiliated non-entity groups that meet regularly. So that is how we're incorporating it now. They are the core decision makers of everything that we do, the plans that we make. In terms of, in this particular context, we've also built out what we're calling the federal legislative accountability table. So that sort of moves beyond the C3 and C4 entities. That allows us to bring local and state leaders directly into conversation with national partners who are also doing work in the state. So we don't segregate that work out. We elevate the voices of our partners on the ground with our newfound national partners so that everyone is on the same page, directly sharing those resources, directly sharing those opportunities. So it's very much an open forum there. That's the idea. I hope that gets the answer that you were looking for. Let me know if you need a little bit more detail on that. Will, do you mind? I saw a question about the For the People Act specifically. I figured I would just jump on that really quickly.
Yeah, I think that's good transition. And for Manchin, and how that illustrates our general approach towards Manchin, which is another question.
Absolutely. So I think the For the People Act is a really great example of how nonpartisan messaging can be effective across the board for what we're trying to do, right? It is not a partisan issue to say that voting is a crucial part of American democracy and that it is a net good for us to be pursuing making that more accessible, more transparent, more trustworthy. And so that is our approach with the messaging right now. We have our national partners doing polling on what's resonating, that's elevated, that dark money seems to be a really core piece that's consistently polling really well. So we've pulled that piece out to focus on. There's a lot going on in the For the People Act, but that gets a lot of focus. Howard, tying that to Manchin, we know that he was a Secretary of State. He was also a governor who oversaw reforms to the voting system. So we're really playing off of his connection to these issues. And because we're playing off of that connection and have the network on the ground and with Manchin himself, we've been able to identify a couple of pieces of persuasive opportunity. So the first piece is that we know that he wants the For the People Act to be bipartisan, or at least have cross-partisan support, right? To have opportunities for everyone to weigh in. He doesn't want to make voting a partisan issue or a one-party issue. Okay, so we're not going to fight him on that. We're going to say, great, ideally, we would love for everyone to get on board with this as well. So we work with our partners to elevate the voices of bona fide Republicans or conservatives who are for this issue, and calling out those who are against the issue for the ways that that is an anti-democratic, process-democratic stance. In addition, we know that Manchin wants to hear from county clerks, and that the current county clerks have been inundated with misinformation. They're sort of in the pocket right now, not because they're being funded, but because they're very closely linked with our current Secretary of State, who is part of the big lie. And so we're working very hard to target them, provide the ones that are persuasive or persuadable with correct, accurate information, and hopefully bring them along to have a conversation with Manchin about why they support this, because right now they do not, and that's a huge opportunity for us to persuade Manchin if we can make that connection happen. So on the For the People Act, it is a multi-layer effort, but the whole piece is we cannot have a strong future for West Virginia if people's voices aren't being heard. They cannot create the West Virginia that they want for their children and their grandchildren if they do not have a say in the way their government functions. Yeah, I feel like I'm getting a little rambly. Will, do you want to hop in and provide additional clarification there?
Yeah, I'll be glad to. I think that another part of the Manchin messaging is that he has been quoted in different ways around the filibuster. Okay, and so if you read carefully, what he says is, I will not vote to weaken the filibuster. And then he goes on to explain that the purpose of the filibuster is to encourage effective, he doesn't use the word cross-partisan, but I think that's more realistic, debate and discussion, and not railroading, one party over the other. And so it can actually fix the filibuster is sort of our buzz phrase for how we're talking about that amongst our groups, is we don't lead with a procedural issue. West Virginians things will not turn out better for their families economically if we fix the filibuster right now, okay? What we have to do is to connect the ability to stop gridlock. Senator Manchin has the ability to stop gridlock and unleash the power of federal government to help West Virginians. Right now, our senator, who's a Republican, Capito, is suggesting an investment in infrastructure less than half of what the president is proposing. And it's our job to make sure that West Virginians understand that the cost of allowing the filibuster to stay as it is in effect shutting down effective progress going forward. And the Manchin needs to fix the filibuster in a way that will allow those voices to be heard, but not allow the one party and a minority to stop everything. So there is a linguistic and a procedural path for Senator Manchin to support changes to the filibuster. And that's what we see as, ultimately allowing him to be consistent with what he said early, but still support this. Is there a guarantee he'll do it? No. Ultimately, Senator Schumer and President Biden have a lot of leverage to encourage Senator Manchin to do that. And our job is to make sure that he's hearing that, 2 out of 3 West Virginians want more government involvement. The 2 out of 3 West Virginians support eliminating the use of dark money and partisan districting and making it harder for people, or making it easier for people to vote. So our job is just to level the playing field so he feels like he won't suffer a political consequence. And we don't want him to suffer a political consequence. This is back to our narrative. If Senator Manchin hadn't figured out how to get elected in a state that went 70% for Trump, after voting against Trump's effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act and voting against Trump's Tax Reform Act that made so much money for wealthy people and corporations, then he still managed to get elected after going against Trump on those two issues. He knows how important it is to take that cross-partisan perspective, which is why I'm hoping that you all will consider helping us building for 2024, where that's going to be a pivotally important race for us. If he weren't where he was, we would not be talking about a Recovery Act and a Rescue Plan and a For the People Act as we are now. And he's been an important part of making that happen, and we have to figure out how to help him do that. And it took me saying that about a dozen times before I didn't choke on my words, but it really, because I've spent a life being frustrated with Senator Manchin in a Democratic context, but we are in a different situation right now, and he's a really valuable part of what we need to do to continue to try to claw back from this precipice we're on in terms of the fate of our democracy.
So, Will, there was a couple of questions that I'm looking at in the chat that I wanted to make sure that we got to. So one is from John Cooper, who said J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy is supposedly about rural, small town Americans accepting personal responsibility for their success or failure. What flipped him to now be running for Senate in neighboring Ohio, if you're able to answer that?
Well, I don't think he has flipped. I think there is an element of accuracy to what he describes. We know that when we poll in West Virginia, that the top scoring trait that people look for in people that they interact with is responsibility across the board: liberal, conservative, moderate, progressive. And so responsibility is something people care about. And it is something that, frankly, progressives and liberals have been uncomfortable talking about because it's been used against so many disadvantaged groups in the past. So we have to be careful about how we do it, but we have to acknowledge that that's something that means something to people and it means something to our world. There's a whole lot more at stake. Some of it, which was reflected in the talking points or the stand of a cross-partisan perspective, that Vance doesn't talk about. And he, who knows if he's doing that for calculated reasons or because he authentically, managed to claw his way through a difficult situation. But he represents, I think, I don't see a big change in any flipping him all along the way. And it'll be interesting to see how his campaign goes in terms of connecting with people. Don't have any prediction on that.
Great. Thank you. And then I know we are coming up on time soon, but I had one more very important question for our group. As you know, we're doers here, and would love to get a little bit more information from you about, number one, what are events that are going on in West Virginia? I think we have some West Virginians on the call. If there's anything you can speak to there, and also, what can we do, as, being out of state, what are some things that we can act on in the short term?
Certainly. I'm so glad we had time for this question. Thank you. Well, first, I just want to flag that we have another wonderful West Virginian from our team on the call. Jonna Bailey is our wonderful Strategic Partnerships Director. Jonna, if you can drop your email in the chat. Jonna would like me to let you all know that the donor table is growing, and we are looking for folks to be part of our leadership committee, and would love to talk with all of you about what that could look like and the various opportunities in West Virginia for folks that are at your level of engagement. So thank you, Jonna. Please hit her up if that is something that you are interested in. I'm also going to drop in the chat 2 links for that out-of-state phone bank that I mentioned that you are all more than welcome to join. Those are on Saturdays and Tuesdays. Beyond that, the folks at Blue Wave are constantly doing postcard campaigns that are connected through us. They send to targeted lists. So far, we've sent postcards to about 100,000 folks in West Virginia who either early voted or voted by mail, letting them know that those awesome opportunities that they had because of the pandemic are on the table for future years if we can pass the For the People Act. West Virginia does not have permanent vote by mail. It's excuse only. So those campaigns are all up and running, and more than more than willing to take on additional interested folks. Beyond that, happy to have you contact me directly. I'm sure we can find a way to plug you in. There's tons of work happening, either virtually or in person. So definitely hit up Jana. Her email is in the chat, and I'll drop the links for the phone bank here right now.
Great. Thank you so much.
With the importance of being local, anybody who is in West Virginia and wants to be involved in an event, which is place specific, should also contact us, because there's a lot of the work that's happening on the grassroots level is in specific places. For instance, we have groups working off of college campuses around the state.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Well, it looks like we are at time. Thank you so much to all three of you for coming and joining us. That was really insightful, and I hope that we're able to, to help you, and we can, work together, have more conversations. That was really informative. Thank you so much. And to all of Big Tent, we hope to see you all next week for Amy Klobuchar on Wednesday, May 26th. As well as Andrea Bernstein on Wednesday, June 16th. So we hope to see you then. And thank you so much, Will, Renee, for joining us. Take care, everybody.